There are 2 days that will, or should, live in infamy. Today marks the 75th anniversary of one of those, Pearl Harbor. Interestingly enough, Pearl Harbor might never have happened. Japan's first plan was to subdue China and use its natural resources and labor to continue the war. Once they had done this, their plan was to attack the Soviet Union. They would attack from the east as Hitler's Germany advanced from the west. Since Japan had so easily humiliated Russia in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, and Japan was now even stronger, Russia seemed an easy target, and one also rich in resources. But China was proving a far more difficult enemy to subdue, and Japan still needed petroleum, rubber, and other resources to press their war. So Admiral Yamamoto, who had been a student at Harvard from 1919 to 1921 and traveled extensively around the United States, was ordered in 1940 to devise an attack on the United States. This was in order to ensure Japan unencumbered access to the resource-rich South Pacific, Australia, and Southeast Asia. Now, Yamamoto understood that the U.S. would enter the war on the side of our British allies if Japan were to take the British Empire resources it desperately needed. So he devised a plan to take the fight out of the big dog, and hopefully the big dog out of the fight, as early and convincingly as possible. So on this date, December 7th, 1941, the enemy that had been planning their surprise attack for more than a year killed some 2,400 men who stood on the decks and in the bellies of 80 ships of the line, virtually our entire Pacific fleet. The day after, Admiral Yamamoto was alleged to have said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." Actually, no record exists that he ever uttered these words. They are more likely the after-the-fact words of a Hollywood scriptwriter, since the first time anyone heard them was in 1970, when the actor portraying Yamamoto says them in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. But what is documented is what he said to his Prime Minister, Prince Kanoi. He said, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." Which was chillingly prescient given that 6 months, to the day later, the Battle of Midway ended with the sinking of 4 of Japan's 6 carriers. At Midway also, 200 of the most experienced Japanese combat pilots met their death. This was more deaths in a single day than they had trained the entire year prior to Pearl Harbor. 6 months to the day later meant the end of Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific to America's west coast. After Pearl Harbor, the citizens of the United States pulled together as never before. Recruiting stations were swamped with young patriots determined to defend our nation. Women rushed to fill jobs vacated by their men. And Rosie the Riveters began to build the ships and tanks and airplanes we needed to defend fascism in Europe and the Pacific. We honor these men and women with the sobriquet of the greatest generation. And we give our generous thanks for their many sacrifices in facing an existential threat to the United States, especially on this day. But 60 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, on September 11th, 2001, an equally determined and deluded enemy murdered nearly 3,000 civilian men, women, and children. Did Americans rush to the recruiting stations? Some did. Most did not. Yet this was also an attack on Americans, this time in the American homeland, by a vicious enemy intent upon destroying us and our way of life and everything we stand for. Murdering 3,000 was just a prelude for them. Did the country pull together to defeat this equally powerful and hateful foe? Some agreed that a military response was appropriate. Some wanted to try to find these murderers and then try them in civilian court, as if this was a typical crime, albeit on a larger scale. Almost all placed "We support our troops" yellow ribbons on our cars, but expected young Americans already serving in the military to deal with this issue. 15 years later, more than 3 times as long as our nation was at World War II, we are still dealing with it. We have tracked down and retaliated against thousands of those who financed, planned, and cheered the cowardly, vicious attacks by a fanatical bunch of Islamist thugs. But along the way, we also created rules of engagement designed to hamstring. If not designed, certainly the effect was to hamstring our efforts to bring this war closer to a conclusion. Our leadership called the most vicious of these thugs the junior varsity team, implying there was no need to spend time or treasure on them. Our leadership created red lines that no one dare cross until they stepped across them with impunity. In World War II, we knew who our allies were, and we knew who the enemy was, and we treated our friends with respect and accommodation. We treated our enemies with peace through superior firepower and the moral integrity that comes from fighting for a cause greater than ourselves. Today, however, our diplomacy is derided by our remaining allies as ludicrous appeasement, and it's proof that we are a paper tiger to the club of autocrats that would destroy us in a moment, if only they could. So even though crippled by equivocating and yo-yo type leadership, and by the inevitable wariness that accompanies goals left unfinished, our Americans serving in the military have responded with honor, with strength, with compassion, and where needed, with a vengeance. And some Americans not in the military, who understand this threat for what it is, but are too old or too young to serve, have supported our troops in every way one can without being in theater. But many Americans still do not understand or are unwilling to accept that this enemy is every bit as fascist, fanatical, and committed to our destruction as were the Japanese and their allies in World War II. They stand at our doorstep today and would slit our collective throats if we let our guard down even for a moment. This is an important day of remembrance. I'd like to say thank you to the boys and girls of 1941, 1942, 43, 44, and 45. I'd also like to say thank you to the boys and girls of 2001 to 2016. With better leadership and clearer direction and focus, they will make us all proud. Pearl Harbor was attacked 75 years ago today. Still we remember. No one will care 75 years from now or even remember the latest people on the cover of People magazine or the rap star of the moment or someone famous for being famous. Americans in 2016 is what they will remember as well. They will care, and they will remember whether Americans in 2016 were able to muster the moral courage that Americans did in 1941. I hope and pray we do not disappoint these future generations. Thank you.